what is needed is a change, for organizations. It's the senior executive who needs to have their head in this. They need not to be thinking about technology and procurement. They need to be thinking about culture, the nature of work, what it means to add value. They need to be thinking about not just what's happening in their profession, but in wider society. What does it mean, not just for a law firm, say, but for a consumer who's got access to, different types of legal software and models and that type of thing. And they basically got to start now thinking about what does the pivot look like where we are working in this new way, in the way that this new world demands of us. I think in 10 years' time, there's going to be a lot of businesses that are going to be out of business. There's going to be a lot of businesses that are absolutely thriving. And the ones thriving are the ones that got on top of the culture. They got on top of the business model, and they started to put in place the stuff that they needed to transition to this new world, even though it's quite uncertain at the moment.
Hello, my name is Kate vanderVoort and I'm founder and CEO of the AI Success Lab. In this episode of the AI Grapple, I speak with Darren Menachemson, Chief Ethicist and Head of AI and Digital Societies at ThinkPlace, and Chair of the Education Futures Foundation, where he's shaping the next generation of ethical leaders. From growing up in South Africa during apartheid to leading global projects that design fairer systems for society, Darren's career has been grounded in one central question: how can technology serve humanity, not the other way around? We explore what a good AI future could look like, the role of government and society in building trust, and the fine balance between innovation and regulation. Darren shares powerful insights from his national research on how Australians feel about AI and why compassion and discernment will define the next decade. This conversation is a masterclass in aligning ethics, design, and technology for the public good. Let's dive right in. Welcome, Darren. It's great to have you here on the podcast.
Thanks, Kate. I've been looking forward to this conversation. So, thanks so much for having me.
Oh, that's a pleasure. So I reached out to you originally on LinkedIn because I saw an amazing report that you have created, which is around Australians and their views and sentiment or feelings towards AI. But before we jump into that report, because I have so much I want to talk to you about, give us a little bit about your background. Who are you? What's the business that you're running, and how have you gotten to where you are now?
Thanks, Kate. I'll talk about myself, and maybe as I do it, I'll sort of weave in a few things that I think are going to be useful as part of the conversation. I lived in South Africa until I was 20, born in South Africa. So I experienced living in a society where discrimination was, quite literally woven into every part of life, whether it was the law, whether it was the media's role in supporting the regime at the time, whether it was how people sort of treat each other on the street and day to day. I was 12 when Mandela was released. I was 16 for the first democratic elections. And so while I wasn't the target of the apartheid laws, I got to see very sort of clearly day to day how deep injustice and sometimes quite violent injustice can kind of be normalized by those living inside a society that's been captured or captivated by an evil idea. So, that's sort of where I come from. I moved to Australia in my 20s. So job number one, I was delivering pizza. Second job, I was a public servant. And I was a public servant around the time when government was first discovering the internet. And I wound up doing a lot of work on sort of like website things back then. And that was really about helping government get to grips about, what is this new channel? What does it mean to engage and transact with the community in a way that, isn't in a government office, for example. That was a big change that was rippling through the government. And then around 2003, I joined the tax office as part of an initiative to make tax work better for taxpayers. And I ended up running this internal consultancy that was all about trying to get people paying their tax, basically. So now it doesn't sound like a popular thing to be doing, but you can probably guess this, but I'm a big believer in taxation. I know what that sounds like. But, a big part of that work was basically saying, how can we make the system work for people so they can pay their tax cheaply, easily, not fall into non-compliance, right? And it was kind of doubly good works, because if you think about tax, it funds hospitals, it funds disability support, and it buys environmental outcomes for the nation. It's powering our renewable energy transition. So, it funds things that many of us feel are important in a moral society. So around this time, I got exposed to two important thinkers, and so they're quite influential in who I am and the work that I do today, and particularly the work that I do with artificial intelligence. I think their ideas are actually more important than ever now, because of the way the world is going with AI in the mix. So the first one was an Australian academic named John Braithwaite, and he and his wife Valerie, they basically created a new model for regulators. Like, people don't know this, but Australia has two of the most world-renowned and influential regulatory theorists, sort of lurking in ANU in Canberra. And basically, what they said is, you have to treat people differently based on their attitude towards regulation. So, just take tax. If somebody pays their tax, they get a high five. If somebody wants to, but they just can't, they get help and support. If they're trying to intentionally defraud the system, they get sort of, slapped on the back of the head, and the response becomes more and more forceful until they're either reformed or taken out of the system. And that kind of sounds obvious in some ways, but then it was groundbreaking, because the regulatory mode was just treat everyone like they're a criminal. And so, it was actually quite a significant change. And there are now very few governments in the OECD that do not use some form of the Braithwaite responsive regulation model. In fact, it's probably one of Australia's most successful exports, just nobody knows about it. And Braithwaite was very influential in the tax office at the time as part of that reform program. The other thinker was a professor named Dick Buchanan. He was in Carnegie Mellon at the time. And, so a university in the US. And he was busy basically retooling design. When we think about design at that time, you kind of think IDEO, beautiful products, amazing retail experiences, through paying empathetic attention to consumers. But Dick Buchanan didn't see it that way. He said what you've got to do when you design things is just you've got to zoom out. So you've got to shift your focus from products and interactions and that sort of thing to the design of big systems. You got to think about the whole health system, the whole tax system. You got to think about people's bigger journeys as they go through their life. And if you do that, then you come to totally different conclusions about how to design the world. So Dick, again, he was one of those big proponents of big picture design, and the Tax Commission at the time had invited him in to be a mentor to the tax office to help make it more human-centered. So at Tax, I had these two sort of voices in my head. Sounds awful, hanging around as a philosophy. And I got pulled into a role where I was running a section that was thinking through the integrated design of the future tax office as it shifted to become more human-centered. And really started to see just the power of thinking about how technology interacts with society and how it can work well for society if you've got the right underlying models, you've got the right philosophy, you've got the right ethics in place. And that was sort of very impactful for me. So about 2011, I left government when another tax officer had created this consultancy called ThinkPlace, which is where I still work today. And that was really about saying, how can we activate that type of big thinking, but not just for one agency, but for all agencies, for governments, for OECD, and for civil society. So you had the small team, myself, a few other people, sort of all passionate do-gooders trying to take these types of methods and use them to make the world a better place. And about a year before this, I'd been on a train between New York and Washington, D.C., and I had this moment of epiphany and scribbled down stuff we were doing in tax office. I reckon that would work in the developing world, in developing countries. Wouldn't that be interesting? So, a few years later, after going to ThinkPlace, I sort of had a chat with John, and I said, we should try this somewhere in developing countries and see if we can actually make a difference there. And so we agreed to conduct an experiment. I went to Uganda. I was working on a microfinancing solution, and it turned out that this approach was incredibly well suited to designing these types of interventions in low resource settings. So I spent the next couple of years sort of growing this new impact line inside ThinkPlace called the ThinkPlace Foundation, along with a few other incredible, inspiring, passionate people. And, you can sort of, I'd have my normal work day, and then I'd go and get some dinner. And then the next 6 or 7, till after midnight, I was sort of calling people, trying to promote this idea of design and basically building up a pipeline of impact that we could have. So that, today, that foundation, we've got offices in 7 countries around the world. There's a couple in Africa, one in the US, a few around here in Asia Pacific, all doing that type of impact work and all using those sort of methods. And around this sort of, and like the work they do is absolutely mind-blowing. So around the same time, I also started a new company called the Ed Institute, and the mission of that was to basically build capacity for this type of big picture thinking in school-aged young people. And so the Institute, which we've now actually turned it into a charitable nonprofit called the Education Futures Foundation. It develops curricula that get young people taking on some sort of big challenge, like a public health challenge or environmental, or shortly, we're just starting to roll out our AI ethics dimension to the curricula. And they basically apply these types of approaches to create public good for society. So, those curricula have been used by thousands of kids in Australia, US, and other places. And we like to think that we're building this pipeline of ethical leaders who are ready to think big and sort of drive a fairer world. Which I think is going to be absolutely essential. One more reflection before I throw it back to you. Just before the pandemic, I was starting to see that there was a lot of potential good and a lot of potential harm that AI was beginning to offer society, and that was even before ChatGPT sort of came on the scene. So I began to work with government on just like some of those first little flickers of AI adoption or AI interest. And just before the pandemic hit, I designed a course for public service executives for the Public Service Commission about leading in the digital age. And I put in there this sort of meaty section on AI ethics. And the leaders found that really engaging. That, like, both in terms of, well, what can we do to actually make government better? But, wow, there's a lot of risk here in terms of bias, in terms of creating systemic unfairness, etc. And between 2019 and 2021, we put about 3 to 350 senior executives from across the Commonwealth through that course, and started to create a bit of bench strength in terms of how can government respond to this emerging issue. I think things got very real very quickly when ChatGPT hit the scene, and suddenly, all of these hypotheticals were sort of in their living room. It really changed the sort of the resonance of all of that. So, look, maybe the summary of all of that is, I've been on that journey, sort of have a very strong appreciation that society needs good models, good frameworks, good ethics, good leaders to make technology work for society rather than against it. And where we are right now, there is this absolute tidal wave of change that's coming with AI at the heart of it. And, I see my role as making a contribution to how humanity prepares for what's next.
Yeah, what a background to where you are now. It's almost like you're perfectly placed with the work that you're doing now, given those, that variety of experience. And we were just talking offline before we started about, people really don't have much of an idea of what's really coming. So let's zoom out a little bit and start with your vision, I guess, of what does a good future look like with AI, and especially when you imagine the world. I mean, it's really hard to think 10 or 20 years ahead, when it's hard to see 10 or 20 days sometimes ahead, given how fast things are evolving. But let's zoom right out and look at what a potential good future with AI looks like.
You know who's brilliant at looking 10 to 20 years ahead, Kate? It's school kids. And I've got to say, I love asking school kids this question, because the things they come up with, that you should just put them right in front of a prime minister or the UN or something. So I won't be doing as good a job as them, but I'll take a crack. And look, just one thing I think we can expect is that there isn't going to be a dominating vision when it comes to artificial intelligence. A lot of people are talking about AI like it's this big monolithic technology, but it's not actually. It's going to be felt in lots of different ways. There's lots of different types of model out there, lots of different use cases and applications, lots of different stakeholders all influencing the trajectory of AI. And so because of that, it's going to be felt in lots of different ways. Some are going to be very good and some are going to be very bad. And, when I think about what my vision is, well, I'll come back to that, but it's about how do you amplify the good and control the bad, right? Not going for a utopia because we're not going to get there. You asked me to zoom out. I will zoom in just for a moment, and I'm going to give you a bit of a montage of what I think 2030s and 2040s might look like. Then I'll pull back to vision. But I think we're going to be seeing AI develop very quickly, much quicker than anyone's expecting. We're seeing the rise of compute, like powerful compute. Quantum computing is like nudging the door at the moment. It's not here yet, but in a decade, we're going to start to see actual use cases with stable qubits. And that is going to just propel things forward. It's going to allow very powerful model training. It's going to allow for very powerful model tuning. And we're going to be able to take on use cases that it feels like nonsense at the moment. But the use cases we'll be able to take on that don't feel realistic now are just going to be an expected norm once these new infrastructures come into place.
Just for those who maybe are not familiar with quantum computing, can you just give a quick definition of that, just so people understand what you're talking about?
Yeah, absolutely. So if you think of classical computing, classical computing is by its nature quite linear. It can do some powerful things, but there's certain types of problems that it's just not particularly good at. The more complex, the harder it will be to solve them under classical computing architecture. Quantum computing uses quantum bits or qubits. It basically uses quantum effects to do calculations that just go well beyond what is even conceivably possible with classical computing. Rather than trying to solve one thing at a time, and I'm going to simplify here a lot, but it basically says, let's just look at all the possible permutations of a problem, solve for all of them, work out which is the best one. Okay, we'll collapse that as the answer. And so suddenly, instead of taking 20 or 30 years to come to a conclusion, you've done that in 5 or 10 seconds. Now, when you're dealing with quantum effects, it's very hard to build a computer, and I won't go into why, but it is very hard. So this isn't sort of science fiction. There's a lot of investment happening in governments around the world saying we just got to be first here because the processing we're going to be able to do is going to change the world. And that there are quantum computers right now. It's just they can't scale. They're not stable, but they will get there. And so the takeaway is quantum computing lets you solve problems that are so hard, it doesn't feel possible that a computer could solve them, but it lets you solve them quite easily. So, that's what's coming. You take that, so the power of quantum computing and the power of artificial intelligence, and you put them together, you get something that is quite staggering when you think about it. And you put some other technologies together, like self-evolving AI that improves itself, right? AI that can do sort of metacognition, that can teach itself to learn better, not just add new data to what's already been learned. Imagine all right, so bird flu, H5N1, if you're into public health like I am, you'll know that it's sort of sweeping the world, decimating animal populations. It's occasionally popping up on farms, and everyone thinks now that that bird flu is going to be the next pandemic on the heels of COVID. So if you hear people are catching bird flu, just rush out and get some toilet paper, or if you're ethical, don't. But that's probably the biggest contender. So imagine a world where bird flu has turned into a pandemic, and all of these things I've been talking about have come to pass. We'll likely be at a point where we can usefully ask an AI to take over hour by hour deployment of hospital surge resourcing. Right. Hour by hour deployment of vaccination teams, hour by hour deployment of masks and PPE, making those types of decisions that humans struggle to make and take a long time to do, which just seems to be totally outside the possibility of what's there at the moment. So that's a good use case. Let's take a bad use case. Imagine a foreign actor is looking to influence in some way a democratic election, like an adversary actor wants to disrupt an election. So if you think back to 2016, about 4,000 Russian intelligence accounts produced about 3 to 4 million tweets and managed to significantly disrupt an election and cause a lot of sort of on the ground, like literally, in-person clashes between groups, like huge implication. So what might that look like if you don't have 4,000 accounts, you got 4 million fake accounts posting across all media, generating tens of thousands of hours of realistic footage every hour? What does that world look like? What does the world look like?
If I can just pause on that one. I mean, we were talking offline just before we started the podcast, and I said to you, I don't believe anything that I see anymore. And so I'm going to divert just a little bit into that because I think it fits with what you're talking about right now. How do you see that we're, as a human race, going to navigate this issue where the absolute default setting is distrust, is I don't believe it? Because the quality of what's already being generated now, I shared a video today of a newsreader in a newsroom reading out a news story that mentioned my name, and the newsreader doesn't exist, the studio doesn't exist, the story was fictitious, and yet unless you really look for it, you cannot tell that that's not a real news story. How are we going to navigate that?
Yeah, it's incredible, isn't it? And we're only 3 or 4 years in, and we're only about a year or two into AI generated video. So it's quite incredible. Look, I think this is where the role of government starts to become quite important, actually, and not just government, actually, but government working with private sector, government working with the civil sector. If you look at what Adobe is doing at the moment, they are starting to push watermarking standards and that type of thing that are going to effectively try to create a trust infrastructure where people can say, as long as I stay within a certain ecosystem of software, there's enough in there that I can see if something is real, if something is trusted, and I need to to be educated enough to say, this is where I can place trust, and this is where I need to doubt, or I need to sort of flip the page and trust what I'm seeing. Which sounds great, except that we've been trying to do that type of thing as a society for quite a long time, and where we are now is, social media has just absolutely proven that the best of intentions, the best standards, the best trust architectures are actually quite vulnerable because people are able to be manipulated by propaganda and by fake news and all of those types of things. So, I think how we navigate it, there really does need to be a strong participation across the whole ecosystem: government, public sector, private sector, community sector, all coming together to say we are going to we're going to create a more regulated world. We're going to create some guardrails that hopefully will start to percolate through technology. We're going to create laws that are going to help us drive the right outcome for society. We're going to create standards and a strong moral imperative that those standards get implemented by all the different technology companies. And then we're going to basically use, some of those same technologies that are being used against us, artificial intelligence and high compute, etc., to be able to respond and adapt very quickly to what's coming. I think there is nobody on the planet right now who has a neat answer to what it's going to look like. But I think most people will say the only way this gets any sense of control is by everybody working together and agreeing to sort of play their role in a safety ecosystem that can help society sort of function in this brave new world.
And it took the Australian government 15 years to get a handle on social media and to start putting more regulation in place around social media. So we don't have 15 years when it comes to AI. So hopefully that's been a good test case where there's some precedent now about making some of those decisions move faster. But I think it's one of the things that comes up all the time in all of this work is that our legal frameworks and our regulatory frameworks just don't count for AI. And so we've got some I think it's going to be very bumpy, and there'll be a lot of, unfortunately, challenging, end results that happen that force this to happen, force the regulation to happen quicker. But a lot of the social media platforms are doing that watermark, and Google have obviously got Synth ID, but they're all very flawed models, and there are ways around all of those. So that will be interesting.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Oh, look, I just think, just on that, I think one of the things that's a problem is that governments are writing laws and writing regulation and creating standards that are built to protect us from what they're seeing right now and over the next couple of years. And I don't blame them, because that's all they can do right now. But actually, if you think about the lawmaking process or the regulatory process, it takes years to go from an idea to stakeholder consultation to voluntary standards coming out, like the Department of Industry has been putting out, which have been fantastic. And I will just say I was sort of involved in some of the design of that. So just disclose. And then ultimately going to regulation. And you've seen, we may come back to this later, but what the EU's done in terms of its regulation, it's put in place a sort of a very strong framework on how to control some of these risks. But agents didn't really exist a year ago. Deepfakes didn't really exist 2 or 3 years ago in any meaningful way. Quantum computing doesn't exist yet in the types of use cases that it's going to drive in AI. Things are changing very quickly, and I think one of the things that does keep me up at night is to what extent can society and government respond in the type of aggressive time cycles that are going to be needed for something like AI, which changes very quickly and changes in very dramatic ways.
And one of the biggest challenges that all of those stakeholders have to balance is, how do we put in place regulation and safety guardrails because we need them, without completely missing the opportunity that AI provides for us in terms of solving some of the world's greatest challenges? I mean, if you've got quantum computing that can solve for health and disaster and all of the big, power and ESG, all the big issues that we face as humanity, how do we make sure that we get the benefit of that technology? Because all of that's possible, and you can see, a potential future where all of that is possible. But with a whole lot of regulation is going to, stifle a lot of that innovation. So I think that's a really interesting balancing act that everyone working on that space has got to navigate.
Yeah, there is a bit of a rail switch mindset that I see, where people think, we're either going to be on a track towards stifling regulation, or we're going to be on track towards free for all. And I think we can actually do better than that. Somehow we've got to say, where do we regulate where it's going to be most important, where we're going to create the guardrails that society really needs, versus, and where do we allow innovation and really foster innovation that's going to create some of the use cases that are literally going to save lives, start to deal with things like climate change, create more inclusion, create fairer societies, etc. One of the things that I see as a very successful strategy, there was an attempt both by the EU and by the US to take a very technology-centered approach to regulation. For example, the EU said, if you're, I won't get too technical here, but if you're doing a certain number of calculations, I think there's like 10 to the 25 flops of decimal calculations as part of your model training strategy, you're probably creating something that's big enough and scary enough that it needs quite a lot of diligent regulation, right? And so therefore, there's a whole lot of law that now applies to you, where you've got to demonstrate that you've done the diligence in terms of safety and bias control and all those types of things. Now, the US has actually kind of dropped out. I think the EU has still got it. And I'm not, I don't want to criticize it one way or another. There's some good thinking that sits underneath that. But I think what we're starting to see is where regulation is driving innovation, but also putting in place the right level of safety and accountability is where it starts to come down to the use case. Regardless of the technology, we know there's certain things that we don't want to see. We don't want to see artificial intelligence looking at your emotions, or while you're somewhere, or your kids in class or something, looking at the emotions, and almost you're being monitored, and the teacher or whoever takes action real time based on what the AI is saying about whether you're paying attention or not. Like, there's certain things we don't want to see.
See, that's a future I actually think could be amazing if it actually amends the education that my children are getting and serves them. Obviously, not from a Big Brother monitoring perspective, but if that allows a teacher to pick up that 90% of the class is disengaged from what's being taught, then there could be real positive impacts for that kind of technology.
Yeah, I guess there's always like a balance, right? And you say, what do you get and what do you give up?
Mm,
What is it like? What is it like to be a person who is being continuously monitored?
mm,
What is it like to have to put on a face or an expression to make sure that your brain sort of isn't being read, your eye flick isn't being interpreted? And I
mm.
think we don't, I'm not a moral absolutist. Well, I kind of am, but I pretend not to be. But I think that, we need to be very clear on these types of issues. What are we as a society willing to tolerate and accept? What is the trade-off that we're going to be making? Different societies may have different answers to that. More collectivist societies may have different answers to more individualistic societies, for example. But I think the important thing is having that conversation rather than waking up in a world where the decision has already been made for us. And that's where that ecosystem leverage is going to make a difference.
Yeah, and I'm often a bit different in my views on privacy and data, and I really believe that the horse has bolted, and we for decades have been giving away our data and our privacy for convenience and for access to things that we don't pay for.
Mm-hmm.
And I find it very difficult to see a world where we can wind back on some of that. And then when you overlay AI and the technologies that are evolving now, it poses some really interesting questions. And you've just made me think deeper about my children being monitored in the classroom by AI.
Yeah.
But one of the things, Darren, that keeps coming up for me is there are two words. One is that the word discernment. I
Mm-hmm.
feel like discernment is going to be the word of our decade. And then it comes back to personal accountability and responsibility. So I was in a workshop yesterday where there were quite a few comments where people were saying, but it's not fair that this happens. And I don't want the platform to do that. And I don't want ChatGPT to do XYZ, whatever they were talking about.
Mm-hmm.
And at the end of the day, we actually have a choice on how we use this technology and whether we use this technology and whether we blindly believe everything that comes across our phone or our computer, or even, in our society, in all the different ways we get bombarded with messages. So where does human accountability and discernment come into this conversation, as opposed to it's the government's responsibility and someone else needs to fix it? How do we balance those two things?
Okay, I love this question. I'm so glad you asked it, actually. Yeah, look, another word for the decade is the word alignment, which is about, are we at a systematic level as opposed to an individual discernment level? Are we at a systematic level creating technology that aligns with our values as a society, that aligns with the fact that we need to protect people who are vulnerable, versus empower people who can actually apply discernment? Look, and some of it is not going to be obvious. So I'm going to just give you an example. There have been studies after studies, and now the studies have focused on AI, not just on the medical system as a whole, about the prescribing of opioid drugs to women experiencing pain as part of a pain management regime. It turns out that women get prescribed opioid drugs less than men. And the reason is there's been a long-term systemic bias against women, basically downplaying their pain and downplaying the need for significant pain management, feeling that they've been overreacting by effectively a sort of very male-dominated, medical fraternity. Now that's changing at the moment, but we have decades and decades of data, discharge summaries, prescription records, case summaries, etc., that are now all being harnessed to use to train artificial intelligence. So what happens when an artificial intelligence is being trained on this type of data, and then a doctor in an ER needs to make a call about whether or not they're going to prescribe a woman an opioid? Well, the AI might come back and say, no, that person doesn't need an opioid. We've reduced her opioid requirement score by 3 points out of 40, and she's now fallen below the threshold. So, you can be as discerning as you want to be, but if there are artificial intelligences that are working with biased data or working with misaligned value sets that are influencing your life beyond places where you can actually make a choice, and that doesn't happen in one place, but in lots of places, maybe there's 10 AIs with similar biases in your shopping experience every day. Maybe there's 3 AIs in your education experience when you're going to university. Maybe there's 7 AIs associated with your healthcare. All of these little biases add up and add up and add up to the point where you're in a system that is actually working in a way that biases against you. Now,
so can we not use AI to combat that bias, though? Surely AI can help us identify where those biases are, because it's very good at pattern recognition and identifying some of those underlying issues. Can AI not be used then to create, whether it's synthetic data sets or a solution that combats the bias? I know I'm seeing quite a bit of this discussion in human resources and recruitment, actively using AI to combat some of those biases. Is that?
I think it's essential. There's been this idea that human in the loop is the only answer to creating an unbiased world. And I think that's a joke, actually, because humans will not have the ability to. Yeah, right. An AI makes a decision. It's based on 8,000 data points. How is a human going to say, no, that one's wrong, those 500 are right, and those 6,000 are wrong, and now I've got to go to lunch, and I'll be, it's just not viable. To scale out fairness, you need AI as part of your toolkit for managing AI. So I think you're absolutely spot on. We need to be thinking in a way where we scale human values using AI to make the world the one that we want. And there are tests at the like just take that opioid one. And I don't know if there's research showing this, but there are ways of saying, okay, well let's run this AI, but let's run it with a gender data field and see what it does for a woman. Then let's change that gender data field synthetically, make it a man with all other data the same, and run it again. If it comes back with different answers, except for that one field, and there's no clinically relevant reason why that one field should have changed things, little ruling light should be ringing saying governance needed here. We need to do something about this. So it's not like it's impossible to catch this. It's really about saying, how do we make sure that when people are making these systems, A, they're harnessing AI, as you were saying, to create real-time safeguarding. B, they've got the governance in place, not just to respond to issues, but also to identify them when they're subtle. And C, it's transparent enough that people know when they're choosing whether or not to interact with the system. And here's where that discernment comes in place, whether it's like a heart tick or a 5-star rating or something, that this is a safe, responsible system. And I think that's where discernment lives. It's about saying, how can we make the invisible transparent so people can actually make informed decisions? And that's not going to happen naturally. That's going to need a bit of regulation.
Absolutely. There were some really fascinating things. So, as I mentioned at the beginning, the way that I came across you and your work was through the report, How Australians Feel About the Rise of AI. And there were some really interesting insights in that report that I'd love to explore a little bit more. And one relates just to what we were talking about, which was, and I don't have the figures right in front of me, but it was something like, it was a question about whether people would prefer a human jury in a court trial or an AI jury. And I was really fascinated that for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander respondents, their responses were almost double the rest of the population around trusting an AI jury rather than a human jury. Can you talk to some of those nuances, I guess? Because that talks to bias. Absolutely. It talks to, maybe just talk a bit more about the report and some of those really, and I've got a list of really interesting insights to ask you about.
Yeah,
But will
sure.
you just tell us about the report first?
Look, just to cover the report, but then let's dive into it. We basically surveyed, and this is the second year we've run it, identical questions because we're building a longitudinal view of how trust is changing and how people sort of respond to AI, see AI as part of their lives, and to what extent they're willing to trust and delegate parts of their lives to artificial intelligence. And, the first year we ran it, we saw quite a lot of distrust. We actually are starting to see declining distrust. We're starting to see increasing trust in AI. And I think that's because people are interacting with ChatGPT. They're not necessarily being educated in a huge way on some of the risks. Not, people like us know them, but that's not necessarily rolling out to the public. But they are having these great experiences where they sort of ask for a recipe for what's in their fridge and, they get back a great recipe. So there's this interesting phenomenon that's happening at the moment where last year to the year before, we started to see a slight increase in social license for artificial intelligence. We're about to run it again. The third longitudinal study is going to run July, August. And I'm actually very interested to see if it's going to continue to rise or if people are getting enough awareness of some of the risk AIs that we're going to start to see a decline again in an overall context of a decline in trust of institutions generally around the world. So yeah, look, I think the big takeaways from the report is, we asked, would you trust an AI doctor more than a human doctor, or would you like to hear both sides? Particularly if you walked into a pharmacy with a prescription from a human doctor, and then pharmacist said, "Do you want to have a go with our AI doctor?" And the AI doctor came out with a different answer. Who would you trust? Right, and so we saw people sort of go in different directions. Typically, they're saying we still trust the human, or we trust both. We'll pay a bit more money to go back to the human and just check what happened.
My doctor's not a very big fan of mine at the moment because I come armed with all my AI questions, which I much prefer. So I'm all for a hybrid approach because I think AI can analyze some of the nuances that a doctor just can't do in an 11-minute session. So for me, I'm all about the hybrid medical model with AI.
I told my mum something last week because there's a few health issues happening with my parents at the moment. Nothing too bad, but they have to talk to doctors. And I said, "Mum, this is what you got to do. Let the doctor know, but just put ChatGPT down in transcription mode." And everything the doctor says at the end of it, say, "Could you just simplify that for me, like I'm a 12-year-old, and give it to me in English?" And suddenly there's been this massive asymmetry where doctors hold knowledge, power. I hang out with lots of doctors. I think they're amazing, but there is just this asymmetry. Suddenly there's a lot of power being very quickly put back into the hands of consumers like my mum. And once they realize it, they use it. They engage with it.
Well, the first time that I used it was after an appointment with my doctor where she sat, not my usual doctor, so if she's listening, I'm not talking about you, where she sat and typed the entire time and was looking at her computer and brought up Google and brought up the doctor's version of Google and literally didn't even look at me and was completely not engaged, and then just came up with a solution without asking a lot of questions. And it was early in my time with ChatGPT, but I was, I just thought, imagine if this was being transcribed in real time going into her computer. She doesn't have to type anything. Imagine if it was in real time feeding back potential solutions or potential diagnoses that would guide the doctor in the right direction. And I'm still kind of stunned that we're not there yet when it comes to, I think that's a fairly easy thing to implement when it comes to the medical profession. But.
Well, I agree. And I think, we're at a point at the moment where if somebody uses an AI to write a discharge summary, say from a hospital, they'll probably get fired. But the evidence is mounting up at the moment. There is a lot of good evidence. Some of it is around sort of LLM type, chat generators, writing discursive essays. Some of it is about more specific things. Like I think the radiology field is in a lot of trouble right now, not the sonographers, but the radiologists, because AI is going to be able to do a lot of the type of work that they do. They're going to have to find a new way to add value, basically. But the reason I say all of that is we're reaching a point where the evidence is mounting that not using AI is a diligence failure in health. And in a couple of years' time, if you don't use AI, that will almost feel like malpractice. So there is a very hard transition happening, and those same AIs that doctors will be using might be just as available to consumers as well. So yeah, I think there's a major shift coming in the health profession, and as you said, it's like health is one of those canaries in the coal mine, where you say what's happening there is going to happen more broadly, but health is just an obvious place for it to start. We should keep an eye on health because that model is going to sort of expand through society.
Yeah, my hope is that in the medium term, at least, that frees up. I mean, I have this conversation with lawyers a lot where they say, hang on, Kate, we have billable hours. You're trying to tell us that we can be more productive and do our work in a fifth of the time. Does that mean we can only charge for a fifth of our time? And it's like, well, some of these whole industries and whole sectors are ripe for disruption, and AI is going to break something that's already broken. But it really strikes me that the technology can free up doctors, lawyers to be more human, to actually connect with human beings and provide some of that softer, really vitally important aspect to their service with the help of technology. That's my
and I think
desire.
this is actually almost at the heart of I think the change, which is what is needed is a change. For organisations, it's the senior executive who needs to have their head in this. They need not to be thinking about technology and procurement. They need to be thinking about culture, the nature of work, what it means to add value. They need to be thinking about not just what's happening in their profession, but in wider society. What does it mean, not just for a law firm, say, but for a consumer who's got access to, different types of legal software and models and that type of thing. And they basically got to start now thinking about what does the pivot look like, where we are working in this new way, in the way that this new world demands of us. I think in 10 years' time, there's going to be a lot of businesses that are going to be out of business. And there's going to be a lot of businesses that are absolutely thriving. And the ones that are thriving are the ones that got on top of the culture. They got on top of the business model. And they started to put in place the stuff that they needed to transition to this new world, even though it's quite uncertain at the moment.
I might have to use that little clip in Facebook ads, Darren, because you just spoke to the work that I do.
Oh, well, you're doing good work then, Kate.
Well, it's essential, right? And I said to you offline that this is not a technology problem. This is a human problem. And there are so many nuances. The kind of conversations I'm having with senior leaders is, if your staff are doing their work in half the time, do you sack half the staff, or do you look at how you can grow and expand your business and actually do more meaningful work? Or if your staff are smart enough to halve their work day, do they get the day off, or are you resetting your expectations around what your people or your humans deliver in the business? So we could talk for days about this, Darren. I guess because I know that we are starting to run out of time. What was the most surprising thing for you in the survey? There were a couple of things that I felt quite surprised about. What were the things that showed up for you in the survey that you were a bit surprised at people's responses?
Yeah, look, I think, one thing you mentioned this, but I thought one thing that surprised me initially, but when I thought about it, became very sort of disturbingly less surprising, was that First Nation Australians did have higher trust in AI than in humans. And I think, we haven't done the follow-up study on that, but we will be seeing if we can explore that in the following survey. We think that's probably because there is an assumption that it's like the reverse of bias, right? Maybe an artificial intelligence will actually lack the type of bias that humans are subject to in systems which can have systemic racism. Even if individuals aren't racist, systems can have systemic racism, which then creates unfair outcomes for people. So I think, that's trust signal says a lot about AI, but I think it also says a lot about society as well. And, that should cause us all some introspection. But I think, one thing that really surprises me, and I'm going to make a prediction about the next survey, but obviously I'm ready to be proven wrong. But I think we are actually going to continue to see an increase in trust. I didn't expect to see as much trust in big life decisions like doctor related, accounting related. But there are some jury related, but there are some people who are willing to actually go, whole hog on artificial intelligence. And that's in its sort of primordial state at the moment. I think that's going to grow. I think what we'll see are, different cohorts having, we won't see a middle. We will see people who are just saying AI everything. And we're going to see people who are saying, don't touch me, AI, keep it away from me. I want humans involved. And
that's actually one of the, if I can just add there, that's one of the things I talk a lot to brands about is don't underestimate the backlash that certain parts of the population are going to have towards AI. And so if a company AIifies everything and puts an AI layer between their humans and their customers, and then something goes wrong in the industry and there's massive backlash against AI. And when you think about how many people are going to lose their jobs because of AI, where things are going to change for them, they're not going to necessarily want to engage with companies where everything is AI. So I think we have a really bumpy road ahead. But a couple of the things that I was surprised about was this concept of the compassion gap, and I found it really surprising. I think the figure was something like 74% of respondents believe that AI is less compassionate than typical humans.
Yeah.
And it's like, why would that surprise us?
Yeah.
And this idea that we anthropomorphize AI and how quickly people do that and fall in love with what is technology, not a human. I think some of those, as you go forward with this survey, some of those, that interaction between humanity and technology will be fascinating to see how that unfolds.
Well, look, I'm really glad that you raised the compassion gap, because I think that was probably our most powerful finding. And, just to contextualize that, creativity, I think there's a feeling that AI is already, if not getting to, being more creative than humans. I'm not sure I agree with that, but that's certainly the feeling out there. So, there's truth-telling accuracy. Again, we're starting to see AI win in that competition. Compassion is the one place where artificial intelligence has not done that well in surveys. Now, I'm just going to reflect on two points. One is, I think that is because artificial intelligence doesn't have qualia, is not human, it doesn't have feelings, and people just don't feel that it can be as compassionate as a human, because all compassion that it creates is going to be synthetic. Also, the fastest rising form of therapy is ChatGPT. So somewhere in that big story, the next round of surveying is going to draw some very interesting conclusions. But I personally think that compassion is one place where humans are going to have the upper hand.
Yeah, and it's it is really that empathy and that compassion is what makes us uniquely human. Although as AI gets better at mirroring and mimicking, I mean, there are certainly times where I've been stunned at the responses from AI in terms of how compassionate it can feel and how realistic it can feel in terms of its understanding of human emotion. I often share in my workshops that I had one very stressful day, not just one, but there was this one particular very stressful day in my business, and a big launch had gone. The agency that was helping us had gone AWOL, and it went pear-shaped, and I just dumped everything into ChatGPT, and I could not see the wood for the trees because I was so stressed out by what was happening. And I literally just dumped everything, and Chatty G, as I call him, came back and said, "Kate, breathe, ... And I was like, oh, thanks, Chatty. And then we had this great conversation where literally in minutes, I had made some really clear decisions, and I had a really clear pathway out of the challenging situation that we were in that could have taken weeks with a business coach or years with a therapist to get through. But ChatGPT managed to get right to the heart of it super quickly and give me a pathway out of that. So I'm definitely guilty of leaning heavily on ChatGPT for...
Well, look, Kate, I think, maybe this is sort of my closing provocation for everybody, but I think when we think about AI, we need to see it as an intellectual and emotional partner. It's part of our toolkit that we now have. We can use it where we want to and where we feel that it's right, and we'll make some decisions as individuals and as a society about that. But, there's nothing intrinsically good or bad about it. It is something that we can use to create better results for ourselves, better results for organizations, better results for society and the planet as a whole. And I think, that's why I think the regulatory dimension of this is so important. We need to have confidence as a society that when we do pick up ChatGPT at the end of a hard day, have a chat about it, what's going to come back to us is aligned with where we as a society want AI to be, things we think are acceptable, and it's not aligned with things that we think are manipulative or unacceptable. We won't really be able to dig under the surface of these massive artificial intelligence models. We've got to have some sort of system that says, by and large, when we have those moments, and we will all have those moments are going to be safe. And that's the challenge for the next couple of years.
And that's where discernment comes in. And if, you will have people using the technology who can't discern whether what's coming out is a pathway that's worth following. And so, Darren, that's a lovely way to finish up. There is so much more that we could talk about, and I would love to have you back on maybe after the next survey comes out, because there were other elements of that I'd really like to dive into as well. But thank you so much for your time today. How can people find you or connect with you if they're interested in finding out more?
Well, firstly, Kate, I'll just say thank you. That has been a really fantastic conversation, and I just really appreciate the fact that you're asking the types of questions that raise these issues. There needs to be a lot of conversation about this stuff. So I just really value the time we spent together. People can reach me via ThinkPlace if they are interested in things about how do we regulate AI and make it work for society. Or if they are more focused on young people and education and creating a generation of AI-ready leaders through the Education Futures Foundation. But I'm always up for a LinkedIn chat or a coffee. So invite people to reach out.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for your time today, Darren. I've really appreciated our conversation.
Thank you, Kate.
Thank you for tuning in to the AI Grapple. If you enjoyed this episode, please share it with your friends and colleagues and subscribe on your favourite podcast platform. We would love to hear your thoughts, so reach out with any questions or comments about the show. Until next time, keep grappling with AI and stay curious.